After we've taken a look at our soul wounds and our soul helograms, and then we've established some soul healing goals, the next place to go with that is to start communicating with our spouse about those things that we found out. And that's the tough spot. I mean, I think it's tough to kind of become aware of what's going on inside of us, but it's also really tough to start sharing that with our spouse. So one of the things before we kind of move into some actual tools in the soul healing model we want to teach you is about those things that are detrimental in couples communication. And we're looking at Dr. John Gottman's research. And basically what he's done is he's the fellow that did the longitudinal study. It's over the last 20 years, he's taken couples and they've actually moved in, he's wired them up on biofeedback with hidden cameras, and he's observed them and watched them interact. And he and his team of researchers will actually calibrate their interactions. So what he's done is he's cracked the code on what makes marital communication work and what makes marriages fail. So he can predict with 97% accuracy what couples, which ones will end in divorce based on their interactions, and which couples will make it to a successful end. So I think it's important to kind of see what's healthy about communication and what's not. And the first thing that he found that was extremely unhealthy in communication is stonewalling. And stonewalling, Dr. Gottman listed as just withdrawal. And you can stonewall by just turning around and walking out of the room, not talking about something. You could stonewall by, gestures like, I don't want to talk about this, or, enough. Or stonewalling could be just verbally saying, I'm not going to talk about this, leave me alone. He did find that the gender that was the most guilty of stonewalling was men. Men just typically want to, scoop the negative issues under the table. The second predictor of divorce he found was criticism. And he said that, women were definitely guilty of criticism, and usually women, by far and away in all the cultures that he studied, bring the thorny issues to the table. The problem is they bring it to the table in the form of criticism. So instead of saying, I would really prefer that you record the checks in the register when you write them, because that makes it easier for me to balance the checkbook, they would say, what kind of guy doesn't record the checks, and how irresponsible is that? And so they're bringing the thorny issues to the table in the form of criticism. And women were more the nags or the criticizers or the introducers of the thorny issues through criticism. The third predictor of divorce was defensiveness. And both genders were equal opportunity defenders, both men and women. And defensiveness is just basically not owning the part that you play, like we talked about, not seeing what's it like living with me. And then the fourth predictor of divorce was contempt. And Gottman calls this the cascading cycle of marital dysfunction. And I call it the toilet bowl, the giant sucking sound that sucks couples into it, where very typically, in a classic destructive dyad, the woman introduces the thorny issue. It's met by stonewalling or defensiveness. She reintroduces it, because we're not to be defeated. We're going to reintroduce it. In the average conflict, the woman will reintroduce the conflict 3 times. So she introduces it again. It's met with stonewalling. She introduces it the 3rd time, and he says, look, I can't get her off my back. Fine, I'll deal with it. But he deals with it with defensiveness. So then he says, yes, maybe I don't record the checks, but you never unload the dishwasher on time. And then she meets his defensiveness with defensiveness, and then typically this is when the couple does whatever they do or don't do, and that's stop, walk away, don't resolve it, get mad, hurl insults, sometimes moves to volatility, but whatever that dysfunctional pattern is, it usually stops the conflict right there. And since it doesn't get resolved, it grows into the last predictor of divorce, which is contempt. And contempt is just that growing feeling of disdain, disgust, lack of connection or care. He describes contempt as when instead of talking about your partner's behavior, you start talking about your partner's character. And you say, instead of, well, gee, he's just, really so busy right now. He really needs to stop and record those checks because he can be very forgetful. You say things like, he's the most irresponsible, lazy, uncaring person. And do you see how, when you're speaking to character, there's a lot of hopelessness. It's not going to change. There's a lot of despair. And it just grows and builds this kind of awful, dark place in a couple. Now, the things that Gottman found that were predictors of marital success, those things were more positives than negatives. Duh. I mean, if you're going to say negatives, and all couples fight. That's what he found. He said it's amazing that, all couples have conflict. You can't take two different people, put them in the same environment, and not have conflict. It's just the way in which they do that can be destructive. But if couples have more positives than negatives, and I thought it would be like 20-1 or 30-1. It's 3-1. It's 3 positives for every negative. The second one was repair attempts. And couples who made more frequent repair attempts had a more lasting marriage. And repair attempts were anything that got the couple in a connected place after a conflict. The third thing he found that kept couples together was receiving each other's influence or accepting each other's influence. And that is if I have an idea, Tom weighs that idea as equally as he does his own. If he has an idea, I weigh it equally to mine, and I receive his influence, and he receives my influence. Then the last thing that he found that kind of kept couples together was what he called a soft startup. And that is, all couples fight, he said, but couples who introduce the thorny issues, the conflict, softly had a tendency to stay together longer or more frequently than the couples who introduce them in an angry, harsh manner. And so it's anything from, honey, when you're late for church, it really is embarrassing to me when they all stare at me when I come in, to, look what kind of a jerk puts his family through that kind of public humiliation. You see the differences. One's a soft startup and the other is a harsh startup. As we are resolving conflict in a marital dyad, we're going to look at levels of anger. And the reason we look at levels of anger is because there are some things that you're just going to have to get over. There are some things, and we tell couples this all the time, there are annoyances and irritations that you're just going to flat have to get over in your marriage. And so we say an annoyance is the bothersome feeling you get about your partner's tedious, trifling behaviors. If you put a lot of energy in that, you're really wasting a lot of good marital energy and time. If annoyances aren't dealt with, then you move to irritations, and irritations then become even more burdensome, even more trifling, even more bothersome. Like he makes his sandwich and he leaves crumbs on the counter. Now, once again, we say though, these are things that happen. These are just occurrences that happen. And if you are going to spend a lot of energy on those things, when the big things come, when the real mountains come, you have no energy because you've climbed silly little molehills in your marriage. There are worse things, and I'm going to spend my energy on the next quadrant, and that is frustration, guys. Now, when you're dealing with a frustration, and that is defined as a feeling of dissatisfaction, often accompanied by anxiety and depression, and it's usually based on a sense that needs are not fulfilled or problems are unresolved. This is like, it just keeps building and building, and usually like frustration, then we always say when you've hit that level, you can react. When you hit that level, it's worth some energy. Very typically, it's also when a soul wound is being triggered. And that's when it's important. And that would be when you're late and you don't call. When I ask after, repeatedly, would you please have the house picked up when I come home? And, you disregard my request. Or would you please stay on a budget, and you don't stay on a budget. And I feel disrespected. So can you see the difference then? These are things that start becoming injurious to the soul. And then if frustrations go unaddressed, it moves to anger. And anger is defined by Webster as a strong feeling of displeasure or belligerence, and it's aroused by real or perceived wrong. And anger then, there's usually some kind of impulse to retaliate, and it could be like passive-aggressive retaliation. Like, I'm just going to forget his dry cleaning or burn his dinner. Or it could be aggressive, like verbally or even physically assertive. And then if anger isn't dealt with, it moves to rage. And that's just this seething of the soul. And rage is when you feel a soul injustice has occurred and you feel violated. And usually rage then could be acted out by passive-aggressive affairs are passive-aggressive rage, or explosive anger and volatility, or in some cases just this kind of hidden, repressed seething or contempt for a mate. When anything from frustration, anger, rage on down, it needs to be dealt with. It does need to have energy. It needs to be addressed, and minimizing those things is not good in marriage. So what we're going to teach you in just a few minutes are 2 tools to help you deal with frustration, anger, and rage in your relationships.